Chapter 10. Leave-taking. A single lantern, its shutters half closed, hung from a nail on a stall post, casting a dim light. Deep shadows swallowed most of the stalls. As Rand came through the doors from the stable yard, hard on the heels of Matt and the warder, Perrin leaped up in a rustle of straw from where he had been sitting with his back against a stall door. A heavy cloak swathed him. Lan barely paused to demand, "Did you look the way I told you, blacksmith?" "I looked," Perrin replied. "There's nobody here but us. Why would anybody hide?" "Care and a long life go together, blacksmith." The warder ran a quick eye around the shadowed stable and the deeper shadows of the hayloft above, then shook his head. "No time," he muttered half to himself. "Hurry, she says." As if to suit his words, he strode quickly to where the 5 horses stood tethered, bridled and saddled at the back of the pool of light. 2 were the black stallion and white mare that Rand had seen before. The others, if not quite so tall or so sleek, certainly appeared to be among the best the 2 rivers had to offer. With hasty care, Lan began examining cinches and girth straps, and the leather ties that held saddlebags, waterskins, and blanket rolls behind the saddles. Rand exchanged shaky smiles with his friends, trying hard to look as if he really was eager to be off. For the first time, Matt noticed the sword at Rand's waist and pointed to it. "You becoming a warder?" He laughed, then swallowed it with a quick glance at Lan. The warder apparently took no notice. "Or at least a merchant's guard," Matt went on, with a grin that seemed only a little forced. He hefted his bow. "An honest man's weapon isn't good enough for him." Rand thought about flourishing the sword, but Lan being there stopped him. The warder was not even looking in his direction, but he was sure the man was aware of everything that went on around him. Instead, he said with exaggerated casualness, "It might be useful," as if wearing a sword were nothing out of the ordinary. Perrin moved, trying to hide something under his cloak. Rand glimpsed a wide leather belt encircling the apprentice blacksmith's waist, with the handle of an axe thrust through a loop on the belt. "What do you have there?" he asked. "Merchant's guard indeed," Matt hooted. The shaggy-haired youth gave Matt a frown that suggested he had already had more than his fair share of joking, then sighed heavily and tossed back his cloak to uncover the axe. It was no common woodsman's tool. A broad, half-moon blade on one side of the head and a curved spike on the other made it every bit as strange for the 2 rivers as Rand's sword. Perrin's hand rested on it with a sense of familiarity, though. "Master Luhan made it about 2 years ago for a wool-buyer's guard. But when it was done, the fellow wouldn't pay what he had agreed, and Master Luhan would not take less. He gave it to me when—" He cleared his throat, then shot Rand the same warning frown he'd given Matt. "When he found me practicing with it. He said I might as well have it, since he couldn't make anything useful from it." "Practicing," Matt snickered, but held up his hand soothingly when Perrin raised his head. "As you say, it's just as well one of us knows how to use a real weapon." "That bow is a real weapon," Lan said suddenly. He popped an arm across the saddle of his tall black and regarded them gravely. "So are the slings I've seen you village boys with. Just because you never used them for anything but hunting rabbits or chasing a wolf away from the sheep makes no difference. Anything can be a weapon if the man or woman who holds it has the nerve and will to make it so. Trollocs aside, you had better have that clear in your minds before we leave the 2 rivers, before we leave Emond's Field, if you want to reach Tarvalon alive." His face and voice, cold as death and hard as a rough-hewn gravestone, stifled their smiles and their tongues. Perrin grimaced and pulled his cloak back over the axe. Matt stared at his feet and stirred the straw on the stable floor with his toe. The warder grunted and went back to his checking, and the silence lengthened. "It isn't much like the stories," Matt said finally. "I don't know," Perrin said sourly. "Trollocs, a warder, an Aes Sedai. What more could you ask?" "Aes Sedai," Matt whispered, sounding as if he was suddenly cold. "Do you believe her, Rand?" Perrin asked. I mean, what would Trollocs want with us? As one, they glanced at the warder. Lan appeared absorbed in the white mare's saddle girth, but the three of them moved back toward the stable door, away from Lan. Even so, they huddled together and spoke softly. Rand shook his head. I don't know, but she had it right about our farms being the only ones attacked. And they attacked Master Luhan's house and the forge first, here in the village. I asked the mayor. It's as easy to believe they are after us as anything else I can think of. Suddenly he realized they were both staring at him. You asked the mayor? Matt said incredulously. She said not to tell anybody. I didn't tell him why I was asking, Rand protested. Do you mean you didn't talk to anybody at all? You didn't let anybody know you're going? Perrin shrugged defensively. Maureen Sedai said not anybody. We left notes, Matt said, for our families. They'll find them in the morning. Rand, my mother thinks Tarvalon is the next thing to Shael Ghul. He gave a little laugh to show he did not share her opinion. It was not very convincing. She tried to lock me in the cellar if she believed I was even thinking of going there. Master Luhan is stubborn as stone, Perrin added, and Mistress Luhan is worse. If you'd seen her digging through what's left of the house, saying she hoped the Trollocs did come back so she could get her hands on them. Burn me, Rand, Matt said. I know she's an Aes Sedai and all, but the Trollocs were really here. She said not to tell anybody. If an Aes Sedai doesn't know what to do about something like this, who does? I don't know. Rand rubbed at his forehead. His head hurt. He could not get that dream out of his mind. My father believes her. At least, he agreed that we had to go. Suddenly, Moraine was in the doorway. You talked to your father about this journey? She was clothed in dark grey from head to foot, with a skirt divided for riding astride, and a serpent ring was the only gold she wore now. Rand eyed her walking staff. Despite the flames he had seen, there was no sign of charring, or even soot. I couldn't go off without letting him know. She eyed him for a moment with pursed lips before turning to the others. And did you also decide that a note was not enough? Matt and Perrin talked on top of each other, assuring her they had only left notes the way she had said. Nodding, she waved them to silence and gave Rand a sharp look. What is done is already woven in the pattern. Lan? The horses are ready, the warder said, and we have enough provisions to reach Berlon with some to spare. We can leave at any time. I suggest now. Not without me. Egwene slipped into the stable, a shawl-wrapped bundle in her arms. Rand nearly fell over his own feet. Lan's sword had come half out of its sheath. When he saw who it was, he shoved the blade back, his eyes suddenly flat. Perrin and Matt began babbling to convince Moraine they had not told Egwene about leaving. The Aes Sedai ignored them. She simply looked at Egwene, tapping her lips thoughtfully with one finger. The hood of Egwene's dark brown cloak was pulled up, but not enough to hide the defiant way she faced Moraine. I have everything I need here, including food, and I will not be left behind. I'll probably never get another chance to see the world outside the Two Rivers. This isn't a picnic trip into the Waterwood, Egwene, Matt growled. He stepped back when she looked at him from under lowered brows. Thank you, Matt. I wouldn't have known. Do you think you three are the only ones who want to see what's outside? I've dreamt about it as long as you have, and I don't intend to miss this chance. How did you find out we were leaving? Rand demanded. Anyway, you can't go with us. We aren't leaving for the fun of it. The Trollocs are after us. She gave him a tolerant look, and he flushed and stiffened indignantly. First, she told him patiently, I saw Matt creeping about, trying hard not to be noticed. Then I saw Perrin attempting to hide that absurd great axe under his cloak. I knew Land had bought a horse, and it suddenly occurred to me to wonder why he needed another. And if he could buy one, he could buy others. Putting that with Matt and Perrin sneaking about like bull calves pretending to be foxes, well, I could see only one answer. I don't know if I'm surprised or not to find you here, Rand, after all your talk about daydreams. With Matt and Perrin involved, I suppose I should have known you would be in it too. I have to go, Egwene, Rand said. All of us do, or the Trollocs will come back. The Trollocs? Egwene laughed incredulously. Rand, if you've decided to see some of the world, well and good, but please spare me any of your nonsensical tales. It's true, Perrin said, as Matt began. The Trollocs... Enough, Moraine said quietly, but it cut their talk as sharply as a knife. Did anyone else notice all of this? Her voice was soft, but Egwene swallowed and drew herself up before answering. After last night, all they can think about is rebuilding. That, and what to do if it happens again. They couldn't see anything else unless it was pushed under their noses. And I told no one what I suspected. No one. Very well, Moraine said after a moment. You may come with us. A startled expression darted across Lan's face. It was gone in an instant, leaving him outwardly calm. But furious words erupted from him. No, Moraine! It is part of the pattern now, Lan. It is ridiculous, he retorted. There's no reason for her to come along, and every reason for her not to. There is a reason for it, Moraine said calmly. A part of the pattern, Lan. The warder's stony face showed nothing, but he nodded slowly. But Egwene, Rand said, the Trollocs will be chasing us. We won't be safe until we get to Tar Valon. Don't try to frighten me off, she said. I am going. Rand knew that tone of voice. He had not heard it since she decided that climbing the tallest trees was for children, but he remembered it well. If you think being chased by Trollocs will be fun, he began, but Moraine interrupted. We have no time for this. We must be as far away as possible by daybreak. If she is left behind, Rand, she could rouse the village before we have gone a mile, and that would surely warn the Murdral. I would not do that, Egwene protested. She can ride the Gleeman's horse, the warder said. I'll leave him enough to buy another. That will not be possible, came Tom Merrilin's resonant voice from the hayloft. Lan's sword left its sheath this time, and he did not put it back as he stared up at the gleam. Tom tossed down a blanket roll, then slung his cased flute and harp across his back and shouldered bulging saddlebags. This village has no use for me now, while on the other hand, I have never performed in Tar Valon. And though I usually journey alone, after last night, I have no objections at all to traveling in company. The warder gave Perrin a hard look, and Perrin shifted uncomfortably. I didn't think of looking in the loft, he muttered. As the long-limbed gleeman scrambled down the ladder from the loft, Lan spoke, stiffly formal. Is this part of the pattern too, Moraine, said I? Everything is a part of the pattern, my old friend, Moraine replied softly. We cannot pick and choose. But we shall see. Tom put his feet on the stable floor and turned from the ladder, brushing straw from his patch-covered cloak. In fact, he said in more normal tones, you might say that I insist on traveling in company. I've given many hours over many mugs of ale to thinking how I might end my days. A Trollocs cookpot was not one of the thoughts. He looked askance at the warder's sword. There's no need for that. I am not a cheese for slicing. Master Merrilin, Moraine said, we must go quickly and almost certainly in great danger. The Trollocs are still out there, and we go by night. Are you sure that you wanted to travel with us? Tom eyed the lot of them with a quizzical smile. If it is not too dangerous for the girl, it can't be too dangerous for me. Besides, what gleeman would not face a little danger to perform in Tar Valon? Moraine nodded, and Lan scabbarded his sword. Rand suddenly wondered what would have happened if Tom had changed his mind, or if Moraine had not nodded. The gleeman began saddling his horse as if similar thoughts had never crossed his mind, but Rand noticed that he eyed Lan's sword more than once. "Now," Moraine said, "what horse for Egwene?" "The peddler's horses are as bad as the Durrants," the warder replied sourly. "Strong, but slow plodders." "Bella," Rand said, getting a look from Lan that made him wish he had kept silent. But he knew he could not dissuade Egwene. The only thing left was to help. "Bella may not be as fast as the others, but she's strong. I ride her sometimes. She can keep up." Lan looked into Bella's stall, muttering under his breath. "She might be a little better than the others," he said finally. "I don't suppose there is any other choice." "Then she will have to do," Moraine said. "Rand, find a saddle for Bella. Quickly now. We have tarried too long already." Rand hurriedly chose a saddle and blanket in the tack room, then fetched Bella from her stall. The mare looked back at him in sleepy surprise when he put the saddle on her back. When he rode her, it was barebacked. She was not used to a saddle. He made soothing noises while he tightened the girth strap, and she accepted the oddity with no more than a shake of her mane. Taking Egwene's bundle from her, he tied it on behind the saddle while she mounted and adjusted her skirts. They were not divided for riding astride, so her wool stockings were bared to the knee. She wore the same soft leather shoes as all the other village girls. They were not at all suited for journeying to Watch Hill, much less Tarvalon. "I still think you shouldn't come," he said. "I wasn't making it up about the Trollocs. But I promise I will take care of you." "Perhaps I'll take care of you," she replied lightly. At his exasperated look, she smiled and bent down to smooth his hair. "I know you'll look after me, Rand. We will look after each other. But now you had better look after getting on your horse." All of the others were already mounted and waiting for him, he realized. The only horse left riderless was Cloud, a tall grey with a black mane and tail that belonged to John Thane, or had. He scrambled into the saddle, though not without difficulty, as the grey tossed his head and pranced sideways as Rand put his foot in the stirrup, and his scabbard caught in his legs. It was not chance that his friends had not chosen Cloud. Master Thane often raced the spirited grey against merchants' horses, and Rand had never known him to lose, but he had never known Cloud to give anyone an easy ride either. Lan must have given a huge price to make the miller sell. As he settled in the saddle, Cloud's dancing increased, as if the grey were eager to run. Rand gripped the reins firmly and tried to think that he would have no trouble. Perhaps if he convinced himself, he could convince the horse too. An owl hooted in the night outside, and the village people jumped before they realized what it was. They laughed nervously and exchanged shamefaced looks. "Next thing, field mice will chase us up a tree," Egwene said with an unsteady chuckle. Lan shook his head. "Better if it had been wolves." "Wolves?" Perrin exclaimed, and the warder favored him with a flat stare. "Wolves don't like Trollocs," and Trollocs don't like wolves, or dogs, either. If I heard wolves, I would be sure there were no Trollocs waiting out there for us. He moved into the moonlit night, walking his tall black slowly. Moraine rode after him without a moment's hesitation, and Egwene kept hard to the Aes Sedai's side. Rand and the Gleam brought up the rear, following Mat and Perrin. The back of the inn was dark and silent, and dappled moon shadows filled the stable yard. The soft thuds of the hooves faded quickly, swallowed by the night. In the darkness, the warder's cloak made him a shadow too. Only the need to let him lead the way kept the others from clustering around him. Getting out of the village without being seen was going to be no easy task, Rand decided as he neared the gate, at least without being seen by villagers. Many windows in the village emitted pale yellow light, and although those glows seemed very small in the night now, shapes moved frequently within them, the shapes of villagers watching to see what this night brought. No one wanted to be caught by surprise again. In the deep shadows beside the inn, Just on the point of leaving the stable yard, Lan abruptly halted, motioning sharply for silence. Boots rattled on the wagon bridge, and here and there on the bridge moonlight glinted off metal. The boots clattered across the bridge, grated on gravel, and approached the inn. No sound at all came from those in the shadow. Rand suspected his friends, at least, were too frightened to make a noise. Like him. The footsteps halted before the inn in the greyness just beyond the dim light from the common room windows. It was not until John Thane stepped forward, a spear propped on his stout shoulder, an old jerkin sewn all over with steel discs straining across his chest, that Rand saw them for what they were. A dozen men from the village and the surrounding farms, some in helmets or pieces of armor that had lain dust-covered in attics for generations, all with a spear or a wood axe or a rusty bill. The miller peered into a common room window, then turned with a curt, "It looks right here." The others formed in two ragged ranks behind him, and the patrol marched into the night as if stepping to three different drums. "Two Darvel Trollocs would have them all for breakfast," Lan muttered when the sound of their boots had faded. "But they have eyes and ears." He turned his stallion back. "Come." Slowly, quietly, the warder took them back across the stable yard, down the bank, through the willows, and into the wine spring water. So close to the wine spring itself, the cold, swift water, gleaming as it swirled around the horses' legs, was deep enough to lap against the soles of the riders' boots. Climbing out on the far bank, the line of horses wound its way under the warder's deft direction, keeping away from any of the village houses. From time to time, Lan stopped, signing them all to be quiet, though no one else heard or saw anything. Each time he did, however, another patrol of villagers and farmers soon passed. Slowly, they moved toward the north edge of the village. Rand peered at the high-peaked houses in the dark, trying to impress them on his memory. A fine adventurer I am, he thought. He was not even out of the village yet, and already he was homesick. But he did not stop looking. They passed beyond the last farmhouses on the outskirts of the village and into the countryside, paralleling the north road that led to Turin Ferry. Rand thought that surely no night sky elsewhere could be as beautiful as the Two Rivers sky. The clear black seemed to reach to forever, and myriad stars gleamed like points of light scattered through crystal. The moon, only a thin slice less than full, appeared almost close enough to touch if he stretched, and a black shape flew slowly across the silvery ball of the moon. Rand's involuntary jerk on the reins halted the grey. A bat, he thought weakly, but he knew it was not. Bats were a common sight of an evening, darting after flies and bite-me's in the twilight. The wings that carried this creature might have the same shape, but they moved with the slow, powerful sweep of a bird of prey. And it was hunting. The way it cast back and forth in long arcs left no doubt of that. Worst of all was the size. For a bat to seem so large against the moon, it would have had to be almost within arm's reach. He tried to judge in his mind how far away it must be, and how big. The body of it had to be as large as a man, and the wings. It crossed the face of the moon again, wheeling suddenly downward to be engulfed by the night. He did not realize that Lan had ridden back to him until the warder caught his arm. "What are you sitting here and staring at, boy? We have to keep moving." The others waited behind Lan. Half expecting to be told he was letting fear of the Trollocs overcome his sense, Rand told what he had seen. He hoped that Lan would dismiss it as a bat or a trick of his eyes. Lan growled a word, sounding as if it left a bad taste in his mouth. "Drakka." Egwene and the other Two Rivers folk stared at the sky nervously in all directions, but the gleeman groaned softly. "Yes," Moraine said. "It is too much to hope otherwise." And if the murderer has a drag car at his command, then he will soon know where we are, if he does not already. We must move more quickly than we can cross-country. We may still reach Turin Ferry ahead of the murderer, and he and his trollocs will not cross as easily as we. A drag car, Egwene said. What is it? It was Tom Merrilin who answered her hoarsely. The end of legends, worse than trollocs and half created. Moraine's head jerked toward him as he spoke. Not even the dark could hide the sharpness of her look. Before anyone could ask the Gleeman for more, Lan began giving directions. We take to the North Road now. For your lives, follow my lead. Keep up and keep together. He wheeled his horse about, and the others galloped wordlessly after him. Chapter 11. The Road to Turin Ferry. On the hard-packed dirt of the North Road, the horses stretched out, manes and tails streaming back in the moonlight as they raced northward, hooves pounding a steady rhythm. Lan led the way, black horse and shadow-clad rider all but invisible in the cold night. Moraine's white mare, matching the stallion stride for stride, was a pale dart speeding through the dark. The rest followed in a tight line, as if they were all tied to a rope with one end in the water's hands. Rand galloped last in line, with Tom Merrilin just ahead, and the others less distinct beyond. The Gleeman never turned his head, reserving his eyes for where they ran, not what they ran from. If Trollocs appeared behind, or the Fade on its silent horse, or that flying creature, the drag car, it would be up to Rand to sound an alarm. Every few minutes he craned his neck to peer behind while he clung to Cloud's mane and reins. The drag car. Worse than Trollocs and Fades, Tom had said. But the sky was empty, and only darkness and shadows met his eyes on the ground. Shadows that could hide an army. Now that the grey had been let loose to run, the animal sped through the night like a ghost, easily keeping pace with Lan's stallion. And Cloud wanted to go faster. He wanted to catch the black, strained to catch the black. Rand had to keep a firm hand on the reins to hold him back. Cloud lunged against his restraint as if the grey thought this were a race, fighting him for mastery with every stride. Rand clung to saddle and reins with every muscle taut. Fervently he hoped his mount did not detect how uneasy he was. If Cloud did, he would lose the one real edge he held, however precariously. Lying low on Cloud's neck, Rand kept a worried eye on Bella and on her rider. When he had said the shaggy mare could stay with the others, he had not meant on the run. She kept up now only by running as he had not thought she could. Lan had not wanted Egwene in their number. Would he slow for her if Bella began to flag? Or would he try to leave her behind? The Aes Sedai and the warder thought Rand and his friends were important in some way, but for all of Moraine's talk of the pattern, he did not think they included Egwene in that importance. If Bella fell back, he would fall back too, whatever Moraine and Lan had to say about it. Back where the Fade and the Trollocs were. Back where the dragcar was. With all his heart and desperation, he silently shouted at Bella to run like the wind, silently tried to will strength into her. Run! His skin prickled, and his bones felt as if they were freezing, ready to split open. The light help her run! And Bella ran. On and on they sped, northward into the night, time fading into an indistinct blur. Now and again the lights of farmhouses flashed into sight, then disappeared as quickly as imagination. Dogs' sharp challenges faded swiftly behind, or cut off abruptly as the dogs decided they had been chased away. They raced through darkness relieved only by watery pale moonlight, a darkness where trees along the road loomed up without warning, then were gone. For the rest, murk surrounded them, and only a solitary night bird's cry, lonely and mournful, disturbed the steady pounding of hooves. Abruptly, Lan slowed, then brought the file of horses to a stop. Rand was not sure how long they had been moving, but a soft ache filled his legs from gripping the saddle. Ahead of them in the night, light sparkled as if a tall swarm of fireflies held one place among the trees. Rand frowned at the lights in puzzlement, then suddenly gasped with surprise. The fireflies were windows, the windows of houses covering the sides and top of a hill. It was Watch Hill. He could hardly believe they had come so far. They had probably made the journey as fast as it had ever been travelled. Following Lan's example, Rand and Tom Merrilin dismounted. Cloud stood head down, sides heaving. Lather, almost indistinguishable from the horse's smoky sides, flecked the grey's neck and shoulders. Rand thought that Cloud would not be carrying anyone further that night. "Much as I would like to put all these villages behind me," Tom announced, "a few hours' rest would not go amiss right now. Surely we have enough of a lead to allow that." Rand stretched, knuckling the small of his back. "If we're stopping the rest of the night in Watch Hill, we may as well go on up." A vagrant gust of wind brought a fragment of song from the village and smells of cooking that made his mouth water. They were still celebrating in Watch Hill. There had been no Trollocs to disturb their bell time. He looked for Egwene. She was leaning against Bella, slumped with weariness. The others were climbing down as well, with many a sigh and much stretching of aching muscles. Only the warder and the Eyes to Die showed no visible sign of fatigue. "Oh, I could do with some singing," Matt put in tiredly. "And maybe a hot mutton pie at the White Boar." Pausing, he added, "I've never been further than Watch Hill. The White Boar is not nearly as good as the Wine Spring Inn." "The White Boar isn't so bad," Perrin said. "A mutton pie for me, too. And lots of hot tea to take the chill off my bones." "We cannot stop until we are across the Turin," Lan said sharply. "Not for more than a few minutes." "But the horses," Rand protested. "We'll run them to death if we try to go any further tonight. Moraine Sedai, surely you—" He had vaguely noticed her moving among the horses, but he had not paid any real attention to what she did. Now she brushed past him to lay her hands on Cloud's neck. Rand fell silent. Suddenly the horse tossed his head with a soft whicker, nearly pulling the reins from Rand's hands. The grey danced a step sideways, as restive as if he had spent a week in a stable. Without a word, Moraine went to Bella. "I did not know she could do that," Rand said softly to Lan, his cheeks hot. "You, of all people, should have suspected it," the warder replied. "You watched her with your father. She will wash all the fatigue away, first from the horses, then from the rest of you." "The rest of us? Not you?" "Not me, sheepherder. I don't need it, not yet. And not her. What she can do for others, she cannot do for herself. Only one of us will ride tired. You had better hope she does not grow too tired before we reach Darvalon." "Too tired for what?" Rand asked the warder. "You were right about your Bella, Rand," Moraine said from where she stood by the mare. "She has a good heart, and as much stubbornness as the rest of you Two Rivers folk. Strange as it seems, she may be the least weary of all." A scream ripped the darkness, a sound like a man dying under sharp knives, and wings swooped low above the party. The night deepened in the shadow that swept over them. With panicked cries, the horses reared wildly. The wind of the drag car's wings beat at Rand with a feel like the touch of slime, like chittering in the dank dimness of a nightmare. He had no time even to feel the fear of it, for Cloud exploded into the air with a scream of his own, twisting desperately as if attempting to shake off some clinging thing. Rand, hanging onto the reins, was jerked off his feet and dragged across the ground. Cloud screaming as though the big grey felt wolves tearing at his hocks. Somehow he maintained his grip on the reins. Using the other hand as much as his legs, he scrambled onto his feet, taking leaping, staggering steps to keep from being pulled down again. His breath came in ragged pants of desperation. He could not let Cloud get away. He threw out a frantic hand, barely catching the bridle. Cloud reared, lifting him into the air. Rand clung helplessly, hoping against hope that the horse would quieten. The shock of landing jarred Rand to his teeth. But suddenly the grey was still, nostrils flaring and eyes rolling, stiff-legged and trembling. Rand was trembling as well, and all but hanging from the bridle. That jolt must have shaken the fool animal too, he thought. He took 3 or 4 deep, shaky breaths. Only then could he look around and see what had happened to the others. Chaos reigned among the party. They clutched reins against jerking heads, trying with little success to calm the rearing horses that dragged them about in a milling mass. Only 2 seemingly had no trouble at all with their mounts. Moraine sat straight in her saddle, the white mare stepping delicately away from the confusion as if nothing at all out of the ordinary had happened. On foot, Lan scanned the sky, sword in one hand and reins in the other. The sleek black stallion stood quietly beside him. Sounds of merrymaking no longer came from Watch Hill. Those in the village must have heard the cry too. Rand knew they would listen a while, and perhaps watch for what had caused it, then return to their jollity. They would soon forget the incident, its memory submerged by song and food and dance and fun. Perhaps when they heard the news of what had happened in Emmons Field, some would remember and wonder. A fiddle began to play, and after a moment a flute joined in. The village was resuming its celebration. "Mount," Lan commanded curtly. Sheathing his sword, he leaped onto the stallion. The drag car would not have showed itself unless it had already reported our whereabouts to the Murdral. Another strident shriek drifted down from far above, fainter, but no less harsh. The music from Watch Hill silenced raggedly once more. "It tracks us now, marking us for the half-man. He won't be far." The horses, fresh now as well as fear-struck, pranced and backed away from those trying to mount. A cursing Tom Merrilin was the first into his saddle, but the others were up soon after. All but one. "Hurry, Rand!" Egwene shouted. The drag car gave shrill voice once more, and Bella ran a few steps before she could rein the mare in. "Hurry!" With a start, Rand realized that instead of trying to mount Cloud, he had been standing there staring at the sky in a vain attempt to locate the source of those vile shrieks. More, all unaware, he had drawn Tam's sword, as if to fight the flying thing. His face reddened, making him glad for the night to hide him. Awkwardly, with one hand occupied by the reins, he resheathed the blade, glancing hastily at the others. Moraine, Lan, and Egwene, all were looking at him, though he could not be sure how much they could see in the moonlight. The rest seemed too absorbed with keeping their horses under control to pay him any mind. He put a hand on the pommel and reached the saddle in one leap, as if he had been doing the like all his life. If any of his friends had noticed the sword, he would surely hear about it later. There would be time enough to worry about it then. As soon as he was in the saddle, they were all off at a gallop again, up the road and by the dome-like hill. Dogs barked in the village. Their passage was not entirely unnoticed. Or maybe the dogs smelled Trollocs, Rand thought. The barking and the village lights alike vanished quickly behind them. They galloped in a knot, horses all but jostling together as they ran. Lan ordered them to spread out again, but no one wanted to be even a little alone in the night. A scream came from high overhead. The warder gave up and let them run clustered. Rand was close behind Moraine and Lan, the grey straining in an effort to force himself between the warder's black and the Aes Sedai's trim mare. Egwene and the Gleeman raced on either flank of him, while Rand's friends crowded in behind. Cloud, spurred by the dragcar's cries, ran beyond anything Rand could do to slow him, even had he wished to, yet the grey could not gain so much as a step on the other two horses. The dragcar's shriek challenged the night. Stout Bella ran with neck outstretched and tail and mane streaming in the wind of her running, matching the larger horses every stride. The Aes Sedai must have done something more than simply ridding her of fatigue. Egwene's face in the moonlight was smiling in excited delight. Her braids streamed behind like the horses' manes, and the gleam in her eyes was not all from the moon, Rand was sure. His mouth dropped open in surprise, until a swallowed bite me set him off into a fit of coughing. Lan must have asked a question, for Moraine suddenly shouted over the wind and the pounding of hooves, "I cannot! Most especially not from the back of a galloping horse. They are not easily killed, even when they can be seen. We must run and hope." They galloped through a tatter of fog, thin and no higher than the horse's knees. Cloud sped through it in 2 strides, and Rand blinked, wondering if he had imagined it. Surely the night was too cold for fog. Another patch of ragged grey whisked by them to one side, larger than the first. It had been growing, as if the mist oozed from the ground. Above them the dragcar screamed in rage. Fog enveloped the riders for a brief moment and was gone, came again and vanished behind. The icy mist left a chill dampness on Rand's face and hands. Then a wall of pale grey loomed before them, and they were suddenly enshrouded. The thickness of it muffled the sound of their hooves to dullness, and the cries from overhead seemed to come through a wall. Rand could only just make out the shapes of Egwene and Tom Merrilin on either side of him. Lan did not slow their pace. "There is still only one place we can be going," he called, his voice sounding hollow and directionless. "Murdrala Sly," Moraine replied. "I will use its own slyness against it." They galloped on silently. Slaty mist obscured both sky and ground, so that the riders, themselves turned to shadow, appeared to float through night clouds. Even the legs of their own horses seemed to have vanished. Rand shifted in his saddle, shrinking away from the icy fog. Knowing that Moraine could do things, even seeing her do them, was one thing. Having those things leave his skin damp was something else again. He realized he was holding his breath, too, and called himself 9 kinds of idiot. He could not ride all the way to Turin Ferry without breathing. She had used the one power on Tam, and he seemed all right. Still, he had to make himself let that breath go and inhale. The air was heavy, but if colder, it was otherwise no different than that on any other foggy night. He told himself that, but he was not sure he believed it. Lan encouraged them to keep close now, to stay where each could see the outlines of others in that damp, frosty greyness. Yet the warder still did not slacken his stallion's dead run. Side by side, Lan and Moraine led the way through the fog as if they could see clearly what lay ahead. The rest could only trust and follow, and hope. The shrill cries that had hounded them faded as they galloped and then were gone, but that gave small comfort. Forest and farmhouses, moon and road were shrouded and hidden. Dogs still barked, hollow and distant in the grey haze when they passed farms, but there was no other sound save the dull drumming of their horses' hooves. Nothing in that featureless ashen fog changed. Nothing gave any hint of the passage of time except the growing ache in the thigh and back. It had to have been hours, Rand was sure. His hands had clutched his reins until he was not sure he could release them, and he wondered if he would ever walk properly again. He glanced back only once. Shadows in the fog raced behind him, but he could not even be certain of their number, or even that they really were his friends. The chill damp soaked through his cloak and coat and shirt, soaked into his bones, so it seemed. Only the rush of air past his face and the gather and stretch of the horse beneath him told him he was moving at all. It must have been hours. Slow, Lan called suddenly. Draw rein. Rand was so startled that Cloud forced between Lan and Moraine, forging ahead for half a dozen strides before he could pull the big grey to a halt and stare. Houses loomed in the fog on all sides, houses strangely tall to Rand's eye. He had never seen this place before, but he had often heard descriptions. That tallness came from high red stone foundations, necessary when the spring melt in the mountains of mist made the Turin overflow its banks. They had reached Turin Ferry. Lan trotted the black warhorse past him. Don't be so eager, sheepherder. Discomfited, Rand fell into place without explaining as the party moved deeper into the village. His face was hot, and for the moment the fog was welcome. A lone dog, unseen in the cold mist, barked at them furiously, then ran away. Here and there a light appeared in a window as some early riser stirred. Other than the dog, no sound save the muted clops of their horses' hooves disturbed the last hour of the night. Rand had met few people from Turin Ferry. He tried to recall what little he knew about them. They seldom ventured down into what they called the lower villages, with their noses up as if they smelled something bad. The few he had met bore strange names like Hilltop and Stoneboat. One and all, Turin Ferry folk had a reputation for slyness and trickery. If you shook hands with a Turin ferryman, people said, you counted your fingers afterwards. Lan and Moraine stopped before a tall, dark house that looked exactly like any other in the village. Fog swirled around the warder like smoke as he leaped from his saddle and mounted the stairs that rose to the front door, as high above the street as their heads. At the top of the stairs, Lan hammered with his fist on the door. I thought we wanted quiet, Matt muttered. Lan's pounding went on. A light appeared in the window of the next house, and someone shouted angrily, but the warder kept on with his drumming. Abruptly, the door was flung back by a man in a nightshirt that flapped about his bare ankles. An oil lamp in one hand illumined a narrow face with pointed features. He opened his mouth angrily, then let it stay open as his head swiveled to take in the fog, eyes bulging. What's this? He said. What's this? Chill grey tendrils curled into the doorway, and he hurriedly stepped back away from them. Master Hightower, Lan said. Just the man I need. We want to cross over on your ferry. He never even saw a Hightower, Matt snickered. Rand made shushing motions at his friend. The sharp-faced fellow raised his lamp higher and peered down at them suspiciously. After a minute, Master Hightower said crossly, The ferry goes over in daylight, not in the night, not ever, and not in this fog neither. Come back when the sun's up and the fog's gone. He started to turn away, but Lan caught his wrist. The ferryman opened his mouth angrily. Gold glinted in the lamplight as the warder counted out coins, one by one, into the other's palm. Hightower licked his lips as the coins clinked, and by inches his head moved closer to his hand as if he could not believe what he was seeing. And as much again, Lan said, when we are safely on the other side. But we leave now. Now? Chewing his lower lip, the ferrety man shifted his feet and peered out at the mist-laden night, then nodded abruptly. Now it is. Well, let loose my wrist. I have to rouse my haulers. You don't think I'd pull the ferry across myself, do you? I will wait at the ferry, Lan said flatly. For a little while. He released his hold on the ferryman. Master Hightower jerked the handful of coins to his chest, and nodding agreement, hastily shoved the door closed with his hip. Chapter 12. Across the Turin. Lan came down the stairs, telling the company to dismount and lead their horses after him through the fog. Again, they had to trust that the warder knew where he was going. The fog swirled around Rand's knees, hiding his feet, obscuring everything more than a yard away. The fog was not as heavy as it had been outside the town, but he could barely make out his companions. Still, no human stirred in the night except for them. A few more windows than before showed a light, but the thick mist turned most of them to dim patches, and as often as not, that hazy glow hanging in the grey was all that was visible. Other houses, revealing a little more, seemed to float on a sea of cloud or to thrust abruptly out of the mist while their neighbours remained hidden, so that they could have stood alone for miles around. Rand moved stiffly from the ache of the long ride, wondering if there was any way he could walk the rest of the way to Tarvalon. Not that walking was much better than riding at that moment, of course, but even so, his feet were almost the only part of him that was not sore. At least he was used to walking. Only once did anyone speak loudly enough for Rand to hear clearly. "You must handle it," Moraine said in answer to something unheard from Lan. "He will remember too much as it is, and no help for it, if I stand out in his thoughts." Rand grumpily shifted his now sodden cloak on his shoulders, keeping close with the others. Matt and Perrin grumbled to themselves, muttering under their breaths, with bitten-off exclamations whenever one stubbed a toe on something unseen. Tom Merrilin grumbled too, words like hot meal, and fire, and mulled wine, reaching round, but neither the warder nor the Aes Sedai took notice. Egwene marched along without a word, her back straight and her head high. It was a somewhat painfully hesitant march, to be sure, for she was as unused to riding as the rest. She was getting her adventure, he thought glumly, and as long as it lasted, he doubted if she would notice little things like fog or damp or cold. There must be a difference in what you saw, it seemed to him, depending on whether you sought adventure or had it forced on you. The stories could no doubt make galloping through a cold fog with a drag car and the light alone knew what else chasing you sound thrilling. Egwene might be feeling a thrill. He only felt cold and damp and glad to have a village around him again, even if it was Turin Ferry. Abruptly, he walked into something large and warm in the murk. Lan's stallion. The warder and Moraine had stopped, and the rest of the party did the same, patting their mounts as much to comfort themselves as the animals. The fog was a little thinner here, enough for them to see one another more clearly than they had in a long while, but not enough to make out much more. Their feet were still hidden by low billows like grey floodwater. The houses seemed to have all been swallowed. Cautiously, Rand led Cloud forward a little way and was surprised to hear his boots scrape on wooden planks. The Ferry Landing. He backed up carefully, making the grey back as well. He had heard what the Turin Ferry Landing was like, a bridge that led nowhere except to the ferryboat. The Turin was supposed to be wide and deep, with treacherous currents that could pull under the strongest swimmer. Much wider than the wine-spring water, he supposed. With the fog added in, it was a relief when he felt dirt under his feet again. A fierce "st" from Lan, as sharp as the fog. The warder gestured at them as he dashed the pair inside and threw back the stocky youth's cloak, exposing the great axe. Obediently, still not understanding, Rand tossed his own cloak over his shoulder to show his sword. As Lan moved swiftly back to his horse, bobbing lights appeared in the mist, and muffled footsteps approached. 6 stolid-faced men in rough clothes followed Master Hightower. The torches they carried burned away a patch of fog around them. When they stopped, all of the party from Emmons Field could be plainly seen, the lot of them surrounded by a grey wall that seemed thicker for the torchlight reflected from it. The ferryman examined them, his narrow head tilted, nose twitching like a weasel sniffing the breeze for a trap. Lan leaned against his saddle with apparent casualness, but one hand rested ostentatiously on the long hilt of his sword. There was an air about him of a metal spring, compressed, waiting. Rand hurriedly copied the warder's pose, at least insofar as putting his hand on his sword. He did not think he could achieve that deadly-seeming slouch. I'd probably laugh if I tried. Perrin eased his axe in its leather loop and planted his feet deliberately. Matt put a hand to his quiver, though Rand was not sure what condition his bowstring was in after being out in all this damp. Tom Merrilin stepped forward grandly and held up one empty hand, turning it slowly. Suddenly, he gestured with a flourish, and a dagger twirled between his fingers. The hilt slapped into his palm, and, abruptly nonchalant, he began trimming his fingernails. A low, delighted laugh floated from Moraine. Egwene clapped as if watching a performance at festival, then stopped and looked abashed, though her mouth twitched with a smile just the same. Hightower seemed far from amused. He stared at Tom, then cleared his throat loudly. There was mention made of more gold for the crossing. He looked around at them again, a sullen, sly look. What you gave me before is in a safe place now, here. It's none of it where you can get at it. The rest of the gold, Lan told him, goes into your hand when we are on the other side. The leather purse hanging at his waist clinked as he gave it a little shake. For a moment the ferryman's eyes darted, but at last he nodded. Let's be about it, then, he muttered, and stalked out onto the landing, followed by his 6 helpers. The fog burned away around them as they moved. Grey tendrils closed in behind, quickly filling where they had been. Rand hurried to keep up. The ferry itself was a wooden barge with high sides, bordered by a ramp that could be raised to block off the end. Ropes as thick as a man's wrist ran along each side of it, ropes fastened to massive posts at the end of the landing and disappearing into the night over the river. The ferryman's helpers stuck their torches in iron brackets on the ferry's sides, waited while everyone led their horses aboard, then pulled up the ramp. The deck creaked beneath hooves and shuffling feet, and the ferry shifted with the weight. Hightower muttered half under his breath, growling for them to keep the horses still and stay to the centre, out of the hauler's way. He shouted at his helpers, chivying them as they readied the ferry to cross, but the men moved at the same reluctant speed whatever he said, and he was half-hearted about it, often cutting off in mid-shout to hold his torch high and peer into the fog. Finally, he stopped shouting altogether and went to the bow, where he stood staring into the mist that covered the river. He did not move until one of the haulers touched his arm. Then he jumped, glaring. What? Oh, you was it? Ready? About time. Well, man, what are you waiting for? He waved his arms, heedless of the torch and the way the horses whickered, and tried to move back. Cast off! Give way! Move! The man slouched off to comply, and Hightower peered once more into the fog ahead, rubbing his free hand uneasily on his coat front. The ferry lurched as its moorings were loosed, and the strong current caught it, then lurched again as the guide ropes held it. The haulers, 3 to a side, grabbed hold of the ropes at the front of the ferry and laboriously began walking toward the back, muttering uneasily as they edged out onto the grey, cloaked river. The landing disappeared as mist surrounded them, tenuous streamers drifting across the ferry between the flickering torches. The barge rocked slowly in the current. Nothing except the steady tread of the haulers, forward to take hold of the ropes and back down again pulling, gave a hint of any other movement. No one spoke. The villagers kept as close to the centre of the ferry as they could. They had heard the Turin was far wider than the streams they were used to. The fog made it infinitely vaster in their minds. After a time, Brand moved closer to Lan. Rivers a man could not wade or swim or even see across were nervous-making to someone who had never seen anything broader or deeper than a waterwood pond. Would they really have tried to rob us? He asked quietly. He acted more as if he were afraid we would rob him. The warder eyed the ferryman and his helpers. None appeared to be listening, before answering just as softly, with the fog to hide them. Well, when what they do is hidden, men sometimes deal with strangers in ways they wouldn't if there were other eyes to see. And the quickest to harm a stranger are the soonest to think a stranger will harm them. This fellow, I believe he might sell his mother to Trollocs for stew meat if the price was right. I'm a little surprised you ask. I heard the way people in Emmons Field speak of those from Turin Ferry. Yes, but... well, everyone says they... but I never thought they would actually. Rand decided he had better stop thinking that he knew anything at all of what people were like beyond his own village. He might tell the Fade we crossed on the ferry, he said at last. Maybe he'll bring the Trollocs over after us. Lan chuckled dryly. Robbing a stranger is one thing, dealing with a half-man something else again. Can you really see him ferrying Trollocs over, especially in this fog, no matter how much gold was offered? Or even talking to a murdral if he had any choice? Just the thought of it would keep him running for a month. I don't think we have to worry very much about dog friends in Turin Ferry. Not here. We are safe for a time, at least. From this lot, anyway. Watch yourself. Hightower had turned from peering into the fog ahead. Pointed face pushed forward and torch held high, he stared at Lan and Rand as if seeing them clearly for the first time. Deck planks creaked under the hauler's feet and the occasional stamp of a hoof. Abruptly the ferryman twitched as he realized they were watching him, watching Mittens. Gloom settled on him even more than it had before. Dark friends. As if fades and trollocs and dragcar were not enough to worry about. At least you could tell a trolloc at sight. Abruptly pilings loomed shadowy in the mist before them. Voice came from somewhere in the mist. Rand's boots clumped from the ramp to a wooden landing. And a silver mark for each of your men, the Aes Sedai added, for the quick crossing. The ferryman hesitated, face pushed forward as if he smelled danger, but at the mention of silver the haulers roused themselves. Some paused to seize a torch, but they all thumped down the ramp before Hightower could open his mouth. With a sullen grimace the ferryman followed his crew. He was really out of the two rivers now, and it seemed much farther away than the width of a river. There, Lan said, handing a last coin to Hightower, as agreed. He did not put up his purse, and the ferrety-faced man eyed it greedily. With a loud creak, the landing shivered. Hightower jerked upright, head swiveling back toward the mist-cloaked ferry. The torches remaining on board were a pair of dim, fuzzy points of light. The landing groaned, and with a thunderous crack of snapping wood, the twin glows lurched, then began to revolve. Egwene cried out wordlessly, and Tom cursed. "It's loose!" Hightower screamed. Grabbing his haulers, he pushed them toward the end of the landing. "The ferry's loose, you fools! Get it! Get it!" The haulers stumbled a few steps under Hightower's shoves, then stopped. Terry's nervousness was palpable. All eyes were on Lan and Moraine, and all but Egwene were leaning back as if torn between losing the pair and getting too close. Rand trotted the last few spans to Egwene's side, leading Cloud, and she grinned at him. He did not think the shine in her eyes was all for moonlight. "It follows the river as if drawn with a pen," Moraine was saying in satisfied tones. "There are not 10 women in Tarvalon who could do that unaided, not to mention from the back of a galloping horse." "I don't mean to complain, Moraine Sedai," Tom said, sounding oddly diffident for him. "But would it not have been better to cover us a little further? Say to Bearlock. If that dragcar looks on this side of the river, we'll lose everything we've gained." "Dragcar are not very smart, Master Merlin," the Aes Sedai said dryly. "Fearsome and deadly dangerous and with sharp eyes, but little intelligent. It will tell the Murdral that this side of the river is clear, but the river itself is cloaked for miles in both directions. The Murdral will know the extra effort that cost me. He will have to consider that we may be escaping down the river, and that will slow him. He will have to divide his efforts. The fog should hold long enough that he will never be sure that we did not travel at least part way by boat. I could have extended the fog a little way toward Bearlawn instead, but then the dragcar could search the river in a matter of hours, and the Murdral would know exactly where we were headed." Tom made a puffing sound and shook his head. "I apologize, Aes Sedai. I hope I did not offend." Aes Sedai?" Matt stopped to swallow audibly. "The ferry, did you... I mean, I don't understand why..." He trailed off weakly, and there was a silence so deep that the loudest sound Rand heard was his own breathing. Finally Moraine spoke, and her voice filled the empty silence with sharpness. "You all want explanations, but if I explained my every action to you, I would have no time for anything else." In the moonlight, the Aes Sedai seemed taller somehow, almost looming over them. "Know this. I intend to see you safely in Tarvalon. That is the one thing you need to know." "If we keep standing here," Lan put in, "the dragcar will not need to search the river. If I remember correctly..." He led his horse on up the riverbank. As if the warder's movement had loosened something in his chest, Rand drew a deep breath. He heard others doing the same, even Tom, and remembered an old saying, "Better to spit in a wolf's eye than to cross an Aes Sedai." Yet the tension had lessened. Moraine was not looming over anyone. She barely reached his chest. "I don't suppose we could rest a bit," Perrin said hopefully, ending with a yawn. Egwene slumped against Bella, sighed tiredly. It was the first sound even approaching a complaint that Rand had heard from her. Maybe now she realizes this isn't some grand adventure after all. Then he guiltily remembered that unlike him, she had not slept the day away. "We do need to rest, Moraine Sedai," he said. "After all, we have ridden all night." "Then I suggest we see what Lan has for us," Moraine said. "Come." She led them on up the bank, into the woods beyond the river. Bare branches thickened the shadows. A good 100 spans from the Turin, they came to a dark mound beside a clearing. Here a long-ago flood had undermined and toppled an entire stand of leather leaves, washing them together into a great, thick tangle, an apparently solid mass of trunks and branches and roots. Moraine stopped, and suddenly a light appeared low to the ground, coming from under the heap of trees. Thrusting the stub of a torch ahead of him, Lan crawled out from under the mound and straightened. "No unwelcome visitors," he told Moraine, "and the wood I left is still dry, so I started a small fire. We will rest warm." "You expected us to stop here?" Egwene said in surprise. "It seemed a likely place," Lan replied. "I like to be prepared, just in case." Moraine took the torch from him. "Will you see to the horses?" "When you are done, I will do what I can about everyone's tiredness. Right now, I want to talk to Egwene." "Egwene?" Rand watched the two women crouch down and disappear under the great pile of tree trunks. There was a low opening, barely big enough to crawl into. The light of the torch vanished. Lan had included feed bags and a small quantity of oats in the supplies, but he stopped the others from unsaddling their horses. Instead, he produced the hobbles he had also packed. "They would rest easier without the saddles, but if we must leave quickly, there may be no time to replace them." "They don't look to me like they need any rest," Perrin said as he attempted to slip a feed bag over his mount's muzzle. The horse tossed its head before allowing him to put the straps in place. Rand was having difficulties with plough, too, taking 3 tries before he could get the canvas bag over the grey's nose. "They do," Lan told them. He straightened from hobbling his stallion. "Oh, they can still run. They will run at their fastest if we let them, right up to the second they drop dead from exhaustion they never even felt. I would rather Moraine Sedai had not had to do what she did, but it was necessary." He patted the stallion's neck, and the horse bobbed his head as if acknowledging the warder's touch. "We must go slowly with them for the next few days until they recover. More slowly than I would like, but with luck it will be enough." "Is that..." Matt swallowed audibly. "Is that what she meant? About our tiredness?" Rand patted Cloud's neck and stared at nothing. Despite what she had done for town, he had no desire for the Aes Sedai to use the power on him. Light, she had much as admitted sinking the ferry. "Something like it." Lan chuckled wryly. "But you will not have to worry about running yourself to death. Not unless things get a lot worse than they are. Just think of it as an extra night's sleep." The shrill scream of the drag car suddenly echoed from above the fog-covered river. Even the horses froze. Again it came, closer now, and again piercing Rand's skull like needles. Then the cries were fading, until they had faded away entirely. "Look," Lan breathed. "It searches the river for us." He gave a quick shrug and abruptly sounded matter-of-fact. "Let's get inside. I could do with some hot tea and something to fill my belly." Rand was the first to crawl on hands and knees through the opening in the tangle of trees and down a short tunnel. At the end of it, he stopped, still crouching. Ahead was an irregularly shaped space, a woody cave easily large enough to hold them all. The roof of tree trunks and branches came too low to allow any but the women to stand. Smoke from a small fire on a bed of river stones drifted up and through. The draft was enough to keep the space free of smoke, but the interweaving was too thick to let out even a glimmer of the flames. Moraine and Egwene, their cloaks thrown aside, sat cross-legged, facing one another beside the fire. "The one power," Moraine was saying, "comes from the true source, the driving force of creation, the force the Creator made to turn the wheel of time." She put her hands together in front of her and pushed them against each other. Saidin, the male half of the true source, and Saidar, the female half, work against each other and at the same time together to provide that force. Saidin, she lifted one hand, then let it drop, is fouled by the touch of the Dark One, like water with a thin slick of rancid oil floating on top. The water is still pure, but it cannot be touched without touching the foulness. Only Saidar is still safe to be used. Egwene's back was to Rand. He could not see her face, but she was leaning forward eagerly. Mat poked Rand from behind and muttered something, and he moved on into the tree cavern. Moraine and Egwene ignored his entry. The other men crowded in behind him, tossing off damp cloaks, settling around the fire, and holding hands out to the warmth. Lan, the last to enter, pulled water bags and leather sacks from a nook in the wall, took out a kettle, and began to prepare tea. He paid no attention to what the women were saying, but Rand's friends began to stop toasting their hands and stare openly. Tom pretended that all of his interest was engaged in loading his thickly carved pipe, but the way he leaned toward the women gave him away. Moraine and Egwene acted as if they were alone. "No," Moraine said in answer to a question Rand had missed. "The true source cannot be used up any more than the river can be used up by the wheel of a mill. The source is the river, the Aes Sedai the water wheel." "And do you really think I can learn?" Egwene asked. Her face shone with eagerness. Rand had never seen her look so beautiful, or so far away from him. "I can become an Aes Sedai." Rand jumped up, cracking his head against the low roof of logs. Tom Merrilin grabbed his arm, yanking him back down. "Don't be a fool," the gleeman murmured. He eyed the women, neither seemed to have noticed, and the look he gave Rand was sympathetic. "It's beyond you now, boy." "Child," Moraine said gently, "only a very few can learn to touch the true source and use the one power. Some of those can learn to a greater degree, some to a lesser. You are one of the bare handful for whom there is no need to learn. At least, touching the source will come to you whether you want it or not. Without the teaching you can receive in Tar Valon, though, you will never learn to channel it fully, and you may not survive. Men who have the ability to touch Saidin born in them die, of course, if the Red Ajah does not find them and gentle them." Tom growled deep in his throat, and Rand shifted uncomfortably. Men like those of whom the Aes Sedai spoke were rare. He had only heard of 3 in his whole life, and thanked the light never in the 2 rivers. But the damage they did before the Aes Sedai found them was always bad enough for the news to carry, like the news of wars or earthquakes that destroyed cities. He had never really understood what the Ajahs did. According to the stories, they were societies among the Aes Sedai that seemed to plot and squabble among themselves more than anything else. But the stories were clear on one point. The Red Ajah held its prime duty to be the prevention of another breaking of the world, and they did it by hunting down every man who even dreamed of wielding the one power. Mat and Perrin looked as if they suddenly wished they were back home in their beds. But some of the women died, too. It is hard to learn without a guide. The women we do not find, those who live, often become... well, in this part of the world they might become wisdoms of their villages. The Aes Sedai paused thoughtfully. The old blood is strong in Emond's Field, and the old blood sings. I knew you for what you were the moment I saw you. No Aes Sedai can stand in the presence of a woman who can channel, or who is close to her change, and not feel it. She rummaged in the pouch at her belt and produced the small blue gem on a gold chain that she had earlier worn in her hair. You are very close to your change, your first touching. It will be better if I guide you through it. That way you will avoid the unpleasant effects that come to those who must find their own way. Egwene's eyes widened as she looked at the stone, and she wet her lips repeatedly. Does that have the power? Of course not, Moraine snapped. Things do not have the power, child. Even an Angreal is only a tool. This is just a pretty blue stone. But it can give off light. Here. Egwene's hands trembled as Moraine laid the stone on her fingertips. She started to pull back, but the Aes Sedai held both her hands in one of hers and gently touched the other to the side of Egwene's head. Look at the stone, the Aes Sedai said softly. It is better this way than fumbling alone. Clear your mind of everything but the stone. Clear your mind and let yourself drift. There is only the stone and emptiness. I will begin it. Drift and let me guide you. No thought. Drift. Rand's fingers dug into his knees, his jaws clenched until they hurt. She has to fail. She has to. Light bloomed in the stone, just one flash of blue and then gone. No brighter than a firefly, but he flinched as if it had been blinding. Egwene and Moraine stared into the stone, faces empty. Another flash came, and another, until the azure light pulsed like the beating of a heart. It's the Aes Sedai, he thought desperately. Moraine's doing it, not Egwene. One last feeble flicker, and the stone was merely a bauble again. Rand held his breath. For a moment, Egwene continued to stare at the small stone. Then she looked up at Moraine. I thought I felt something, but perhaps you're mistaken about me. I'm sorry I wasted your time. I have wasted nothing, child. A small smile of satisfaction flitted across Moraine's lips. That last light was yours alone. It was, Egwene exclaimed, then slid immediately back into glumness. But it was barely there at all. Now you're behaving like a foolish village girl. Most who come to Tarvalon must study for many months before they can do what you just did. You may go far. Perhaps even the Amelin seat one day if you study hard and work hard. You mean... With a cry of delight, Egwene threw her arms around the Aes Sedai. Oh, thank you! Rand, did you hear? I'm going to be an Aes Sedai! Chapter 13. Choices.